In any case, thank you very much. Now I see you can hear me well, thanks. So thank you very much to the delegation for this invitation to this event. It's a pleasure to collaborate from CDOB Barcelona. For those who don't know what CDOB is, it's an international affairs think tank based in Barcelona, ranked among the best in Southern Europe, and dealing with all sort of aspects related to international relations, with a particular focus on geopolitics, on sustainable development and migrations and global cities, and also with a strong look at international dynamics, international players, but more particularly the European Union. And that's why I am sure that I was invited here to make a short introduction to what promises to be a very, very interesting discussion on the matter of the debate, and more related to e-democracy, fight against corruption, and so on, which I am sure that my co-speakers will deal with in the next few minutes. But from my side, what I basically wanted to do is a bit of a general overview of what I think are the 5 main questions that we should address in these post-COVID times that we are entering. Of course, the COVID is not over. Its effects are certainly not over. So it's hard to speak about the post-COVID era, but in any case, I think that what's interesting is to see and ask ourselves to what extent COVID-19 will be certainly a game changer for international dynamics. And these dynamics will necessarily affect anything that we discuss later on. So I think that among these 5 questions, and I'll be short, the first one we need to ask ourselves is whether we are entering a new period in global order, or we are just seeing the acceleration of trends that were among us for the last few years, if not decades. You know very well that international crises can act as triggers of more severe and more long-lasting changes in the international order. But sometimes they don't. As big as they seem, these crises do not have the long-lasting effects that one could expect. So the big question for COVID is, will this crisis be one of those that changes the world we live in, or will it rather be just another example of dynamics that are there in the world we live in? Think about the 9/11. 9/11 was a very important event, a traumatizing event that changed many things in the US relations with the Middle East, for instance, or Europe's relations with the Middle East, but didn't have such a global outreach beyond the expansion of global terrorism that today seems to be much less pressing than it was in the immediate days after 9/11. So it was a very big event, but it was not a game changer overall for global dynamics. Or think about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that led to the First World War. That was an event that could be, although very important in perspective, very small in scale. And yet it changed totally the dynamics of not only Europe, but the global order. So will COVID-19 be a 9/11, or will it be similar to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand? It's very hard to say today, but in any case, what we are certain as we speak is that COVID-19 has reinforced a series of trends that were there already. The trend for the closing of national borders happened at the very beginning of the crisis, increased nationalism in the main world powers, the strength of populism in some responses to the pandemic, the danger that natural or medical disasters can have on human beings, and this brings us to a stage closer to what climate-related crisis can produce. Or even the Asia turn of the global order today. We're looking much more deeply into what Asia is doing, and particularly China. So all these trends will probably be reinforced as a consequence of COVID-19. What we don't know exactly is what sort of world order will have a few years from now. Second big question, and as a consequence of this one, is whether we will see the reinforcement of global cooperation dynamics, or rather the reinforcement of conflictual dynamics at the global scene. Of course, one could think about a global health crisis as an event triggering the need for more global cooperation around the WHO, around research for a new vaccine or for a vaccine, around the development of health plans that take into account that people travel and thus need to be implemented similarly in different countries, and on new cooperation on basic needs for populations. What that could certainly trigger more cooperation at the global scene. But compared to this, what we've seen is increasing tensions between the big powers at the global scene. We've seen a reinforcement of China-US rivalry, particularly along the lines of digital domination or predominance, very different digital models, and very different way to deal with data in different places around the world, and the effect that this can have on the power of governments. And thus, these conflictual dynamics seem to be reinforced also in trade wars, also in the understanding that different countries have of the need for global cooperation, and thus a reinforcement rather than reinforcement of national priorities rather than global cooperation. So this is the second big question. The third big question that I think we need to ask ourselves is whether we are entering a new economic model as a consequence of COVID-19. We are seeing the responses of the European Union, but also other countries beyond the European Union, very much based on fiscal stimulus. Remember that the last big crisis, 2008, the euro crisis and the financial global crisis, rather reinforced dynamics for austerity and dynamics for contention of global spending, of public spending, sorry. And this is seeing very different responses on the side, at least, of the European Union. There's fiscal stimulus, very big fiscal stimulus, both at the national and European level, with the recovery plan that was approved not so long ago and that should start its implementation soon. And thus, there is a different formula that might change the broad and the long-lasting thought in economic policies globally. This also relates to the importance that green economies will have in the future, also relates to the digitalization of our economies, the reconfiguration of global value change, the increasing discourses on the need for protecting sovereignty at the European level vis-a-vis other main powers. So this might eventually lead to a change in the way economic relations are foreseen at the global level. Fourth, as a consequence also of these new economic relations, will we see the emergence of new inequalities. Of course, the rural-urban debate and divide, we've been talking a lot about this divide in the last few years and the importance of global cities in economic output, today can be nuanced with the fact that the rural areas, if well connected, can also be the host of actors and workers that can certainly work from home. And this might eventually change the rural-urban divide as we've seen it in the last few years. However, there are plenty of new digital inequalities that might come out after COVID-19. And this in turn can be the origin and the seed for new sources of populism. We all believe that now populism is gone because they haven't been able, such as leaders such as Johnson in the UK or Trump in the US haven't been able to deliver, or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Modi in India haven't been able to deliver as good as they claimed. But if new inequalities emerge in the post-COVID-19 era, populism will not be over, despite the fact that it has failed in providing for a solid response to the crisis. The fifth question, and finally, and I will leave it here, not to be very long in my introduction, sorry, is what role for the European Union in all this reconfiguration of global dynamics. We have the potential as Europeans to start a new phase in European integration. Certainly, the agreement at the European Council on the recovery plan is promising. For the first time, there is such big-scale borrowing on behalf of the European Commission, on behalf of the whole of the member states. So this means that something close to a fiscal union might be emerging. Insofar, the European Union is borrowing money on behalf of all the member states. This is very different to the response that we gave to the 2008 crisis and the Euro crisis. And this eventually might be the a step forward for a closer political union. You know that the political union emerges when taxes are put together and there is more fiscal capacity, more centralized fiscal capacity. It's very hard to predict whether this is only the first stepping stone towards that end, but certainly is a game changer for European Union integration. So this would be the positive and the optimist attitude towards the reinforcement of European integration and the reinforcement of the European Union as such for future crises and for dealing with similar crises in the future. However, one must take into account as well that the European Union, despite this satisfactory response to COVID-19 today, is also inheriting the consequences of many years of simultaneous crisis, if not a decade long of crisis. Think about the refugee crisis, think about certainly the economic crisis, think about Brexit, think about Poland or Hungary as places where rule of law and democracy are being gravely endangered. So think about all these crises, and then we can also nuance this optimism when thinking long-term about the prospects of the European Union. The European Union has inherited all these crises, still has a legitimacy problem, still has dysfunctionalities, internal dysfunctionalities, still has the consequences of Brexit ahead of it. So probably this is also a more nuanced perspective on the future of the European Union. Whether the Union is reinforced through more political and economic cooperation, or these more long-term perspectives on recurrent crisis prevail, I think this is the big question for the future of the European Union. Too early to answer today, but in any case, very important if we look at the future of the EU in this global order that has certainly changed after COVID-19. I will leave it here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul. I hope you can all hear me well now. I'm very glad that you commented on so many and so diverse topics. This is exactly the idea behind the series of Future Talks debates. And moving on, our next speaker is Dr. David Dueñas-Cid, who is a Catalan researcher working at Tallinn University of Technology, as well as an assistant professor at Kosminski Academy, and he specializes in the field of e-democracy and electronic voting. David?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to the delegation of the Catalan government in the Baltic states and Poland, especially to Eva Chilvik. And yeah, this is, as Eva just introduced me, my name is David Dueñas-Cid. I'm researcher let me just share my screen. I'm sorry for being so academic, but university researchers without a PowerPoint, we are nobody, and I don't want to be different from my colleagues. So that's okay. I think that you can all see my screen already. So as I was saying, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to be part of this series of conference about future talks. And yes, I have been introduced. I'm researching about internet voting and working both in Taltech University and in Kosminski University in Estonia and in Poland. So let's say I'm a truly representative of this European Union diversity that brings one Catalan person to live between the Baltics and Poland and to be switching from one to another. Anyway, coming to this topic, and probably I can make some connection with some of the things that the great introduction of Paul Morillas already highlighted. there are some elements that probably we could discuss about how the future will look like, and I would like to introduce some of them, and I will enlarge them in my presentation in proper timing soon. So as I was introduced, I'm researching about internet voting, and internet voting is somehow one of the flagships of future of democracy. I mean, it have been labeled in the past as some of the hopes for transforming our democratic systems to something that could be slightly different, but so far, after some years, it didn't manage to consolidate all around. And one of the first things that I would like that I will introduce in my future presentation, it's about where is internet voting coming from. I mean, normally when we are trying to make future prognosis and we are trying to, this kind of presentations in which we are talking about the future, they are kind of complex because we know that we will miss some of the shots that we are making. We are going to present some topics, we are going to present some ideas, and we already know that some of them will never happen. So if somebody will see this video in within 10 years, 15 years, they will see that some of the things that I'm saying here, probably they will never happen. But they reflect the questions that we have today about how tomorrow gonna look like. So nowadays, when we are trying to understand how internet voting works, the first thing that we need to do is come back in time to understand where is it coming from. And this is one of the first things that I would like to do in my presentation when it will happen, probably in November or December. Again, if we are looking back in time, we can see, and let me just advance some of the contents that I would like to explain further in the future. It's about how at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, there was a big hope that internet was going to change the whole society. And in fact, it did. It provoked a big impact, as also our colleague Paul Morillas was introducing before, how internet transformed a set of things and how COVID can be also another game changer that I would also like to introduce on this graphic that I put on my slide. So in the 90s, at the beginning of the 2000s, there was a big hope that internet was going to change also democracy. And there was a big peak of interest on all the technologies that could bring to some changes on how we understand the democratic process. So after that, let's say after 2005, 2006, this interest decreased because there were some security concerns, because there were not so many countries that they were trying to introduce internet voting and so on. And this story about internet voting starts collapsing somehow. But some other countries started introducing internet voting for some other elements more connected with increasing the convenience for voters and trying to attract international or external voters to participate in elections. Given that we are living in this kind of situation in which there is every time a higher number of people who is living outside the country, the elections are facing the challenge on how to keep them involved in the management of elections in their own country. And one of the solutions that some countries proposed also was introducing this internet voting system. Right now, we would say that we are on this point. But there is one possibility that some new countries are making one step further to introduce internet technologies in elections, because, and that is the connection I wanted to say, to mention about what Paul Morillas mentioned before, COVID introduced a set of new challenges to the already existing challenges of democracy, meaning how can we organize elections ensuring that the people are going to vote and they will not be scared about coronavirus and they will participate in the elections given the situation that we are living. So it's interesting because one situation that it's challenging for the whole society introduced a set, make visible the potentialities of other types of technology or other things that we would be using that could provide some solutions for the challenging situations that we are living. That's why, and then you will see in the presentation I will make in the future, that we will talk about different moments of the evolution of internet voting, going back in time, going to the present, and seeing which is the potential that we witness for the forthcoming years. There are some countries, for example, like Lithuania, that I think that there will be two presenters later coming from Lithuania, just introduced the use of internet voting in their elections that they're going to happen this October, if I'm not wrong, and many other countries are trying to check how can we do to handle elections in such a challenging time in which we cannot put more than 10 or 20 or 100 persons in the same room. So internet voting came again, and there is this kind of new enlightenment towards this technology, and that can bring some different states. Anyway, first topic that I would like to talk will be connected with this history of internet voting and how internet voting can change, have been changing during the recent years and can continue changing in the future. Second topic I would like to talk, connected with this previous one, it's about the case of Estonia regarding the digitalization process and particularly focused with the internet voting technologies. Estonia, since 2005, and we will come back to this data in a near slide, introduced internet voting, and since then they have been uninterruptedly using internet voting in all the elections. In fact, there have been it raised much interest from international media because it's not only connected with the use of internet voting, but with the process of digitalization of the whole state and how the whole state turned to be what, for example, some newspapers call the digital republic, or the digital country, or the digital state, and how this narration about this fascination about the digital have been widespread through Europe. So I will try to put some attention to how Estonia managed to do that and to connect it again with the history of internet voting and to see which is the positive impacts that Estonia can show to other examples and to other countries that could be interested in following the same technology. In fact, it will be based, and I will probably share some of the things that we have been working on some research that we did in which we were comparing the Estonian case with some other cases and how could it be introduced in other countries. So exploring the sources of the Estonian digital state and the digitalization of the administration, and how can it jump to other examples. So, and connected with the process of internet voting, as I said, from 2005, Estonia have been the only country that uses internet voting in all the elections. Since then, they held 11 elections. We are currently in the 4th electoral cycle, and everything relies on the widespread use of the digital ID as a source of personal identification. Right now, they are exploring other sources of identification, but anyway, you will see. I will deepen more that on my presentation. And we will see also how the internet voting system works and how they manage to create a complex system that has some kind of security back checks that that can provide more trustability into the system in case somebody would pretend to attack the system. And that brought to an increase of the number of population that is using internet voting within the years. From a first use in 2005, where barely 1%, 2% of the population was using internet voting, to the last elections that they held in 2019, where almost half of the population who have right to vote, they were using internet to cast their votes, and how that fits with other types of voting that they have and that I would describe more in detail in the further presentation that I would make. And the third topic I would like to work, I know that we were asked to put 5 topics, but when I was preparing this presentation, I decided to restructure them into 3 and include some of them, most of them, in this third point that it will be a bit wider. And we will talk about potentialities and risks of the use of internet voting. Because of course, this is an open question. Which benefits can I have from using that? Apart of that, it's something fancy that's doing the things through the internet can be fancy, but it can be also practical. As I said, in the times of coronavirus, that can be something that can make our life somewhat easier, but it can be challenging also from many other layers. So we will try to put in the balance the different elements that are included in the introduction of internet voting and to try to discuss them. As everyone can understand, not everything is perfect in any kind of technology, and the important thing is to be well informed about which are the potentialities and risks. So I will talk basically about a set of potentialities and risks. First of all, connected with the creation of convenience for voters, making vote easier. We are seeing how in many places the turnouts, the participation is just decreasing, either because people are less interested in politics, either because politics, we lost like this kind of traditional political references and so on, and or for example, in some cases, how the complexity of the voting system is making the turnout to decrease. The example of the external turnout of the Spanish elections, it's a perfect example of that, since they introduced this new system for voting in which you need to ask a priori, you need to state your interest in that you want to vote in the elections as a foreigner, the turnout decreased. And we will give some data about that and how, for example, this could be overcome by introducing some new sources of technology. How to make life more easy for the people. And when we are talking, and we will develop this point, when we are talking about how to make life easier in terms of elections, we talk basically about two different variables. Giving more time to the people to vote and opening more spaces where the people can cast a vote. Meaning that the traditional approach to elections is that there is one election day. Everybody is going to vote on that election day. And if you are missing the day, then you cannot vote because you are too late. How can we do that? Of course, we cannot enlarge the election at the end. They need to have one deadline in which you cannot cast your vote anymore, but we can enlarge them from the beginning. So that have been some of the approaches that were introduced in how to transform the elections into something more convenient, more easy. The second one is connected with the space, allocating new spaces where people could cast votes. I just put some examples here. I mean, postal voting is an example of that. Recently, for example, in Poland, they had due to coronavirus, they tried to change the electoral system fast and to make the elections fully postal, something that also Trump was mentioning recently. Let's see the evolution on the American elections. In the case of Poland, it didn't work. They had to postpone the elections because the system was not ready for allocating postal, for turning the elections fully postal. Basically because it allocated it introduced lots of challenges, lots of new costs, lots of new people who need to do some tasks in order to make that. And we will talk somehow about the complexity of introducing new voting channels in elections. But anyway, postal voting, for example, could be one example of that. You can vote from home, you receive your vote, you put your vote in the envelope, you send the vote by post, and the vote is sent. So you are changing the time and the space in which you can vote. Voting in advance, voting on embassies, for example, countries that have embassies abroad, you can go normally and cast your vote in the embassy and then they are sending the votes to the country, or other sorts of more innovative voting, like voting in ships, for example, for military voting. Voting in supermarkets is something that we will see that in Estonia they allocate for 1 week before the elections, and 10 days before the elections, they allocate some special voting stations in the most central supermarkets of Tallinn and Tartu, and people can cast their vote there in the same moment that they are going to shop. So in the way to make it more convenient. Voting in airports, for example, there are many ways of making this voting more convenient. And as I said, we will see this is the let's say calendar of elections in Estonia, and we will give some examples about how the Estonian system works and tries to make it more convenient, and how, of course, coronavirus is challenging all that, because if we cannot meet in one single room in order to vote, we need to allocate some ways of introducing some other systems of voting. I will run a bit because I think I'm eating too much time, but the second potentiality I would like to talk is about costs. We made some research in which we were proving that internet voting is the most cost-efficient way of voting amongst the ones that are being offered in the case of Estonia, and we checked that in 2 different elections, and the costs are similar. So that's an interesting result, and that's an interesting potentiality of internet voting. It's an efficient voting system in terms of costs. Third potentiality I would like to underline is the capacity to replicate the elections and the capacity to spill over the method to other ways of decision making. So, for example, if we create a successful system for internet voting, why cannot we think about using this internet voting system for other types of elections? So, for example, for social participation processes. So, for example, for participatory budgets. So, for example, for many other questions that the administration would like to ask to the citizens, and turning it to a more like open and more liquid democracy in which we could ask the citizens much more often the questions that we have. That on the side of the potentialities I would like to describe on my presentation. Let's go fast to the risks, because of course it's not everything beautiful. One of the main risks is the increase of complexity of the electoral system, organizational complexity, legal complexity, technological complexity, political complexity, and something which is really particular is the time management. Elections are one particular case in the overall public administration system in which the time management is much more complex than in other systems. If we have, I don't know, we want to create the participatory website for one city hall, for example, and the website is not working on the day 1, it's not a problem, it will work on the day 10. Of course, it will live in a bad position, this administration, because they didn't manage to do things on time, but they will be able to repair them. In the case of elections, it's not like that. We are asking the people every 4 years, if the system is not working on the day in which you have the elections, you have a serious problem that will not last 1 week, will last 4 years until you will have the next elections. Time management is one big challenge. According to that, we will bring another research that we have been doing recently about the failed introduction of internet voting in a set of islands in Finland. And we will, but anyway, I will get on the details of that. Last point that I would like, and last risk I would like to mention, obviously it's the cybersecurity risk. In my case, I mean, I'm a sociologist working with public administration. I'm not an informatician, but still cybersecurity risks are there. Of course, there are many questions about how to manage data protection system, data protection. How can we ensure that the vote keeps being secret? How can we ensure that the vote is casted as it's intended and it's counted as it was casted? So how can we ensure that the same idea that I had when I decided to vote for party A is going at the end of the voting system and it's saying, yes, this person voted party A, and that nobody can check that this person who voted party A is the person who voted for that. So there are many elements that we need to consider. And also I will put on the table some alternatives and some ways in which this system have been, or these problems of cybersecurity have been solved in some cases. Said that, and sorry for saying that so fast, hoping to see you in the final presentation and in the conference, and thanking once again the delegation of the Catalan government in the Baltics and Poland for the invitation and for the occasion of explaining a bit what we are doing, which is the research that we are doing on terms of internet voting and on terms of electronic democracy, which is a cutting-edge topic in the field of research on society, digital society, public administration. And I would like to give more details on that when I will have the occasion. Hope to see you again, and I hope that yeah, we can have some questions and we can have some interesting discussion. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much, David. It's very interesting that you analyzed both the advantages and the potential associated with internet voting, online voting, as well as the risks related thereto. We generally agree that digital tools and new technologies can enhance democracy and civil society participation, but we also should be aware that they should be applied in a responsible manner. Continuing on the topic of democracy, but in a very different context, our next speaker, Professor Tomas Kabaliauskas from Vytautas Magdus University in Kaunas, will talk about the future of European democracy in the face of changes in Belarus. And as a side comment, when we were talking with Professor Kabaliauskas about this presentation, I told him that there is a very symbolic connection between Catalonia, Polish solidarity movement, and the current opposition movement in Belarus, which is actually a song, Destacant, a Catalan protest song written by Louis Lac, became the anthem of solidarity in the 80s in Poland, and nowadays it is sung in Belarusia by the opposition. Side comment apart, please, Thomas.
First of all, thank you for the invitation to this intriguing conference. Although I do understand we're at the stage of sort of brainstorming, development of ideas for a larger conference, hopefully in Kaunas. I would like to talk or develop ideas about democratic issues in Europe. How are they going to change in the future in the current crisis of Belarus? I think that the whole project of Eastern Partnership has suddenly become alive, because a few years ago it seemed like this Eastern Partnership project quieted down, Yet, of course, in 2014, the events in Kiev, in Maidan, resurrected Eastern Partnership issues, and the role of Lithuania and Poland was exceptionally important in keeping Eastern Partnership ideas alive. I know we know the controversy of the behavior, political behavior of Hungary when they sided together with Kremlin to promote independence or autonomy, rather, of certain parts of western southern Ukraine, in addition to Crimea, instead of supporting democratic processes in Ukraine. So after Maidan, I think we had a few years of relative Eastern Partnership quiet period. As Hegel would say, when there are pages of historic stillness, then nothing is happening really. But now in Belarus, the events in Belarus resurrected Eastern Partnership, and now the question is for the future, since we are having future talks. The question is to what extent democracy in Belarus is going to be liberal or illiberal, because Lithuanian and Polish quality of democracy is very different. We know that in Poland there is a severe problem with law superiority. Law is under control of Kaczynski's all the inner intrigues and political their Prawo i Sprawiedliwość party dominance. Therefore, there are so many concerns about the quality of Polish democracy. Yet Poland is so important with the Solidarność legacy for the development of democracy in Belarus. At the same time, Lithuania, who is not receiving critique from Brussels for violating law superiority, is also an active partner of Belarus and Ukraine. So it's interesting for the future development to see to what extent Lithuanian and liberal democracy and Polish illiberal democracy will have an effect on the development of democracy in Belarus, if it happens at all. Because if Lukashenko remains in power, or he's replaced by someone who is convenient to Kremlin, but it would have just simply another name of a different person, then these issues may also become not so relevant. So the question then is whether it is about simple removal of one person whose name is Lukashenko, when his military staff, all the ministers and generals have training and a very strong cultural background in Moscow. They have completed all these KGB associated schools and have the training. So is it about the removal only of one Lukashenko person, or is it about the fundamental change and fundamental switch to democratic processes and to geopolitical reorientation towards Western European and accepting liberal democracy fundamentally? I think I completely agree with Professor Mažeikis, who has advised me to pay attention to the fact that minority rights is not the right time to discuss in Belarus. Now it's about the very idea to overthrow this totalitarian regime of Lukashenko, who is completely violating human rights, to put it mildly. He has become evidently a very serious criminal. So is it for minority rights the time? I agree with Professor Mažeikis that it is not the time. We should talk about the very principle of democracy and removal of totalitarian Lukashenko's regime. Yet, I noticed on certain videos that there are women rights talks because there are so many peaceful women protesters. I think I noticed a few gay promotion flags, rainbow flags. So I think my liberal democratic ideas and minority rights inevitably in Belarus somewhere is around the corner. I think it's also in the air because people have felt this suppression. So it will be interesting if peaceful protesting will be successful in Belarus, because for now it seems like as much as I was critical of Maidan's militaristic approach to fight Viktor Yanukovych regime, nevertheless, it seems like perhaps there was no other way to win Maidan in Kiev. Perhaps something similar might be, unfortunately, in Belarus, that maybe the ideal of the Velvet Revolution or singing revolution of the Baltic states may not work. But hopefully it will, because I'm a promoter of Gandhi's or Martin Luther King's ideas of non-violent citizen-type resistance. So hopefully it will work, but many people are seeing now the results of militaristic revolution of Maidan, how successful it was, and although indeed bloody. So my hope is that there is a chance for Belarusian Velvet Revolution or Singing Revolution with high culture of protesting, displaying inhumanity of Lukashenko's regime, because if Minsk protests would become also militaristic, then perhaps brutality and inhumanity of Lukashenko's regime would diminish. So the future predictions are quite dangerous here, yet I think certain shadows and shapes are visible, and certain scenarios probably are predictable in terms of whether it's going to be only one person's removal or whether it's going to be a fundamental transformation of Belarus. However, talking about fundamental transformation of Belarus is quite shaky, because we had so many hopes for Russia, for instance, in the early 1990s, when Western political sciences were so optimistic that suddenly the entire world will be neoliberal and capitalism will embrace globally Russia, and suddenly we see that Russia very soon turned back on Vladimir Putin's totalitarian system. Maybe a better word would be authoritarian, as Adam Michnik has pointed out. Maybe more correct would be to call Russia authoritarian, not totalitarian, because certain forms of dissent are allowed. But as we see that with the events in Belarus, more and more brutality in Russia is happening at the same time. Evidently, the elite of Kremlin is also very concerned about what for them is the poison of democratic movements and protesters. We see what happened with Navalny. We know what happened with other people who are active on the internet promoting the ideas to protest Kremlin's ideology. So these are my kind of brief ideas for brainstorming, and hopefully once we have a larger conference, we can develop this more. So, yes.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your remarks on the current situation in Belarus. It's actually very interesting to see as we're having future talks here today. This is the very near immediate future we're talking about, and hopefully in the next few months we'll be able to see which of your remarks, predictions became reality, hopefully towards democratical country. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, also from the Social and Political Critics Center at Vytautas Magnis University in Kaunas, Professor Mažeikis, who will comment and make a presentation on critical theory and cultural policy in the period of civil conflicts, transformations, and revolutions, and their future. Professor Mažeikis.
Hello. Yes, I'm as well involved into, our regional philosophical studies, philosophical and political studies from critical point of view. I'm a follower of critical theory. It means a little bit Frankfurtian approach. I'm happy to study Theodor Adorno, Jürgen Habermas, Axel Honneth, and try to apply their theories, and not only of them, to the current situation, current social, political, and cultural situation in our Eastern Central European region. And the events in Belarus as well are involved me into the discussions with Belarusian activists as previous events in Ukraine. I was involved and participated in Ukrainian Maidan on the streets. And as well, I am very involved into supporting of dissidents of Belarus of contemporary time. However, my interest is a little bit different than Thomas Kavaliauskas, because he comment the general or mainstream tendencies, political tendencies. But I am more interested into cultural anthropologist or political anthropologist viewpoint, to use some political sociology instrument and to work on the micro level, and to study that how, for example, I'm studying how does democratic communication are effective in the protest actions and revolutions. Was going with our communication from a horizontal or rhizomatic point of view. For this reasons, I use theory of communicative action of Jürgen Habermas, and as well some negative dialectics methods for the analysis of the events, as well some actually updated method from post-structural point of view, not directly Adornian, but in a way. What does mean it? It means, first of all, to separate spontaneous communication from organized communicative actions, from public relations, and from propaganda. Propaganda, what does mean in this case? We accept as a massive, repetitive persuasion. It means mechanical or digital repetition of persuasion, especially from mainstream institutions, And we separate this persuasion from the public relations when somebody try to organize social and communicative consent between different groups of people. And then at the other, we are talking about spontaneous expression of their own viewpoints, development of them, and development as well social and cultural ideas and activism in the regions of protest. So for me, it's much more interesting to see how the processes is under developing. And for example, today I discussed with my friends about small cultural events and events in the not in the big streets of Minsk, but in some house gardens, in house squares, you know, in big sleeping regions of the city. It means how the people uses this insurgent rebellion culture for the organization of everyday life in order to organize strikes, you know, or to organize social support each other, or to develop neighborhood security, or to organize horizontal communication between different groups, how multiplicity of groups could be developed, how the variety or diversity of the society is possible, or about autonomism, how does autonomism is possible in contemporary Belarus if hegemonic power presses them everywhere and in very strong way. However, my interest is larger than the only Belarus. I'm interested in the theory of critical theory and cultural policy in general, and for me as well will be quite interesting, first of all, comparative approach where I compare Baltic experience, Ukrainian experience, contemporary Belarus experience, previous Solidarność Poland experience, as well as I'm interested in the other events and experiences before and after Second World War, including Spanish Civil War or contemporary Catalonian or Scottish movements, how is going on the not only macro but as well micro level, how do they organize their autonomism, their communication, how this symbolical interactionism of them are possible, and what kind of cultural expressions they are doing. For example, when I'm talking about cultural expression of liberal ideas, I mean, for example, music and songs, what type of music and songs they sang, and what kind of music they take from abroad and what kind of music they develop, as well as about the performances, what kind of theater performances they are doing in the process of actors, and what kind of banners and chants they are using. What is the role of religious group, how Catholic or other churches participated in the local street events, and how they are involved into community life, especially in the period of processes, how this all micro level of self-organization is going on, and what influences of different persuasion machines are here. For example, for this reason, actually, it's quite important to take many of communicative theories and critically reconsider them for the contemporary events. And one of them, which I quite skeptical, is the theory of crowd and theory of masses, which consider masses as a stupid or which has some irrational body, and such theories don't consider them as a civil society and don't consider the some organization which would like to find self-expression in music, in ideas, in slogans, in ideology, and how these two levels cooperate, micro and macro, you know, on the micro as a major ideology, macro as a major ideology, and micro as a multiplicity of minorities group, how they could cooperate, how these two regimes, horizontal and vertical, could co-work together, you know, and what kind of technological support they need for these purposes, how could they cooperate with the creative industries and cultural industries, and how we need to develop these creative and cultural industries for contemporary purposes, because Adornian and Habermasian approach, which I mentioned before, not always is available for contemporary situation, and even Jürgen Habermas theory not always could help us to understand the revolutionary processes and the events was going on. So as well, I accept conflict theory or contradictionary theory, which means that all these contemporary movements are very ambiguous, but even contradictory and opposed movements could collaborate for some time, for some purposes, and how this collaboration between communities which has nothing common except the power, you know, or one question, how do they could collaborate? This is the area of my research, which combine theoretical approach, critical theory, with many of sociological and anthropological researches in the field of cultural policy and politics. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation. From the 4 different presentations during this online event, the aim of Future Talks, which will be a series of debates on very diverse topics, but touching on how they will look in the future and what impact on the future they'll have. We want to focus on innovation, creativity, reflecting that Catalonia is forward-thinking and future-oriented, but as well thinking about social, political, cultural, and linguistic aspects that we will discuss further. As this first presentation is an introduction to a whole series of debates, to end this online event, we'd like to share with you a prelude by Jan Sebastian Bach, played by Victor Pastor, the Vice President of Casal Català de Polonia, who is a professional musician. And in his interpretation, he'll be playing violin of a piece that was very often played by Pau Casals. Victor, apart from being Vice President of the Casal Català de Polonia, is also a former student of the Music Academy in Warsaw and a current student of Liceu in Barcelona. Thank you very much for participating, Paul, David, Thomas, Pintotas, and everyone watching. And hopefully we will meet soon during another future talks. Thank you very much.